Chapter 1: Shadows in the Forest. The early morning sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing where General Horatio Gates waited. The smell of gunpowder still lingered in the air from days of fighting. Soldiers stood at attention, their faces a mix of exhaustion and quiet pride. The Battle of Saratoga had been won, and now the British General John Burgoyne was coming to surrender. Among the ranks was Major General Benedict Arnold, his leg bandaged tightly from the wound he suffered during the fighting at Bemis Heights. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with the frustration of being sidelined. Though his bold charge had turned the tide of the battle, Gates had excluded him from the ceremony. Standing behind a tree, Arnold watched the scene unfold, bitterness gnawing at him. The glory he craved was slipping through his hands, and he could already feel the sting of being overshadowed by men he considered less deserving. Chapter 2: The Walk of Defeat. General John Burgoyne adjusted his uniform, the scarlet coat now a symbol of defeat rather than power. His once dashing demeanor had been replaced with weariness. As he walked toward Gates, his boots crunched the frost-covered grass. Behind him, his officers followed silently, their faces etched with shame and uncertainty about the future. Burgoyne clutched his sword tightly, feeling its weight as more than just steel. It represented the might of the British Empire, now humbled by what he had once dismissed as a ragtag army. As he approached Gates, he took in the surroundings, the cannon, the soldiers, the defiant American flag rippling in the breeze. He had underestimated these men, and now history would record his failure. Chapter 3: Crossing Paths. Tadeusz Kościuszko, the Polish engineer who had fortified the American defenses, stood near the tent, his keen eyes observing every detail. His fortifications had turned the battlefield into a death trap for the British, and yet his contributions were rarely spoken of. He thought of his homeland, still under foreign oppression, and felt a pang of longing. Perhaps one day, Poland would know the freedom America was fighting for. Not far from Kościuszko stood Daniel Morgan, the rugged frontiersman whose riflemen had wreaked havoc on British officers. He held his hat in his hands, his calloused fingers tracing its brim. Victory was sweet, but the faces of fallen comrades haunted him. War was not glory, it was sacrifice. Chapter 4: The Surrender. As Burgoyne reached Gates, the two generals locked eyes. Gates's expression was calm, almost kind, as he extended his hand. Burgoyne hesitated for a moment, then offered his sword in a gesture of submission. Gates shook his head, refusing to take it, and instead shook Burgoyne's hand. "This is not about humiliation, sir," Gates said quietly. "It is about the future of two nations." The men exchanged a few words, their voices low and formal. Around them, the assembled officers and soldiers watched in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them. This was more than a British surrender. It was a declaration that the American cause was not a fleeting rebellion, but a force to be reckoned with. Chapter 5: Shadows of Tomorrow. As the ceremony concluded, the mood shifted. Soldiers relaxed, some exchanging wary glances with their former enemies. Burgoyne's men, now prisoners, sat quietly under guard. The Americans knew the war was far from over. Victory here did not guarantee independence. Arnold limped away, his frustration boiling over. This victory, his victory, had been stolen from him, and he vowed that one day they would all regret it. Kościuszko returned to his maps, already thinking of the next battle. Morgan walked among his men, offering words of encouragement and silently mourning those who had fallen. Gates stood at the edge of the clearing, watching Burgoyne and his officers disappear into the distance. He knew this victory would echo through history, but for now, it was just another step in a long, uncertain journey. Epilogue. Years later, the painting would immortalize this moment, freezing the faces of men who had shaped history. But the reality was far more complex. Each man carried his own burdens, his own triumphs, and his own regrets. The Battle of Saratoga was a turning point, but for those who lived it, it was just one chapter in a story of sacrifice, betrayal, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. This story draws on the dynamics between historical figures and the emotions behind the event, emphasizing their roles and inner conflicts during this pivotal moment in history.